response enterprise. The Commission's purpose was to bring former government leaders together with business executives to find ways to better prepare for and respond to future crises. Thank you all for answering that call to service. I also want to thank Senator Paul, as well as his staff, for working together with me to hold the Emerging Threats and Spending Oversight Subcommittee's first hearing of the 117th Congress. I look forward to working together to address the emerging national, economic, and homeland security threats facing the United States and identifying ways to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse related to federal spending. I will work with Ranking Member Paul and all of my colleagues on the committee on a bipartisan basis to make our country safer and more fiscally responsible. The Business Executives for National Security, or BENS, was founded nearly 40 years ago as a national and nonpartisan organization to bring senior private sector executives together with government policymakers to discuss business challenges faced by public and private sector organizations dealing with national security issues. While some members of BENS have previously served in government, many have spent much or all of their careers in the private sector and bring fresh perspectives to pressing national security issues. In the summer of 2020, with the United States and the rest of the world battling the COVID-19 pandemic, the organization convened a commission on the National Response Enterprise. They brought together some of the most respected and accomplished leaders from government and corporations to research and analyze many of the factors that lead to effective emergency preparedness and response. The Commission was prompted to make sure that it did not view issues too narrowly through the lens of the current pandemic, but to understand what needs to be done to improve preparedness and response to virtually any type of future crisis, whether it be a pandemic, a natural disaster, a coordinated cyber attack, or an act of terrorism. The Commission was co-chaired by Jay Johnson, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, Alex Gorsky, the Chairman and CEO of Johnson & Johnson, and Mark Gorenzer, the former Managing Director of Booz Allen Hamilton, and the BENS Chairman of the Board. 33 additional commissioners from government, business, and civil society joined these co-chairs, in addition to General Votel, the President and CEO of BENS, to identify ways to increase U.S. resiliency for future crises. I was honored to be included in the process as a guest to provide a congressional perspective alongside my colleague, Senator Cassidy, who is also joining us today. In just a few months, the Commission interviewed 165 government, private sector, and other stakeholders and developed 11 recommendations for ways to improve our preparedness and response capabilities. The Commission's recommendations focused on three key areas: facilitating communication and coordination, delivering supplies and volunteer resources, and leveraging emerging technology. Recommendations range from amending the Stafford Act to include pandemics, cyber events, and other emergencies of extended duration, to expanding the inclusion of non-traditional partners by DHS and FEMA in response efforts. The Commission also recommended consistent and pervasive exercises across the emergency response enterprise and enhancing stockpile resilience by investing in cutting-edge technology that can enable real-time information sharing and rapid decision-making. The Commission's report and the testimony provided today will provide a foundation for action for this subcommittee. I'll work with the Commission, Senator Cassidy, and the members of the subcommittee to introduce legislation to address the issues that we will discuss today to better prepare communities all across the United States to manage future crises. So now we will move to introductions. I want to thank everybody for joining the subcommittee here today. And I'm now going to introduce our witnesses. Ranking Member Paul, when he arrives, will have an opportunity to make an opening statement. But why don't we move now to our witnesses? And it is the practice of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if the witnesses would please raise your right hands. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
I do.
Well, thank you. I'm now going to proceed with witness introductions. First, General Votel. Our first witness today is General Joseph Votel, the President and CEO of Business Executives for National Security, or BENS. General Votel leads the organization's talented staff across 7 regional offices and works with the board of directors and the organization's 400-plus members to develop and execute their strategy. General Votel joined BENS in January 2020 following a decorated 39-year military career where he commanded special operations and conventional forces at every level. In his last military position, he served as the commander of U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM, where he was responsible for U.S. and coalition military operations in the Middle East, Levant, and Central and South Asia. He led the 79-member coalition that successfully liberated Iraq and Syria from the Islamic State Caliphate. He is a non-resident distinguished fellow at the Middle East Institute and the Balfour Center at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. He sits on the executive board of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, is an advisor to the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. General Votel graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and later earned a master's degree from the U.S. Army Command and Staff College and the Army War College. Welcome, General Votel. You may now proceed with your opening 5-minute statement.
Good morning, Chairwoman Hassan and Ranking Member Paul, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the work of the Commission on the National Response Enterprise, convened by Business Executives for National Security last June. Let me start and just enhance on your introduction of BENS here by saying BENS is a national nonpartisan organization of senior executives who volunteer their time, talent, and treasure to address business-related challenges faced by organizations across the national security enterprise. Since its founding in 1982, BENS's members have assisted military and government partners by sharing expertise, recommendations, and best practices from their own experiences in the private sector, and proactively identifying and offering insights, perspectives, and advice on security objectives. Just over a year ago, Americans were barraged around the clock by news of skyrocketing COVID diagnoses and deaths, the devastating toll of the pandemic on the U.S. economy, and supply chain problems from everything from toilet paper to respirators to medical personnel. In these reports, our BENS members recognize business challenges with which they grapple every day and saw an opportunity to use their experience to help, if not immediately, then to strengthen the nation's response to future crises. With that goal in mind, BENS launched the Commission on the National Response Enterprise to create what we believe would be a new emergency response model to strengthen U.S. resiliency through enhanced coordination, communication, and cooperation between government, business, and civil society. We assembled 33 commissioners representing each of these sectors to work on the issue. Former military commanders, our leaders, CEOs of respected American corporations, a former cabinet secretary, a Nobel laureate, former Homeland Security advisors, members of Congress, and state and local leaders. Joining them were 58 additional business leaders, mostly members of BENS, who interviewed 165 government, private sector, and civil society stakeholders and researched 5 critical component areas of emergency response: roles and responsibilities, surge capacity, supplies, management, people, human resources, and infrastructure and economy. I want to take this opportunity to thank Senators Hassan and Cassidy for their support and guidance as commissioners throughout our 90-day work period and in the months since. It has been and continues to be invaluable to us. The Commission ultimately concluded that the nation does not in fact, need a new model of emergency response. The components of an integrated national response capability are present within the U.S. National Response Framework. However, significant execution challenges do exist, particularly when a crisis impacts numerous states simultaneously or extends over a prolonged time period. Gaps and breakdowns in systems and operations have disrupted communication, coordination, and surge in supply chains across all sectors throughout the COVID-19 response. Until these weaknesses are addressed, future pandemics, natural disasters, coordinated cyber attacks, or acts of terror will have the ability to imperil our citizens, cripple our infrastructure, threaten our economy, and put our national security at risk. Now is the time for transformational thinking about emergency response strategy, policies, and processes. The Commission's call to action offers 11 recommendations for redesigning our response capabilities to embrace 21st century realities in how the U.S. handles national crises. They are focused in 3 areas: facilitating communications and coordination, delivering supplies and volunteer resources, and leveraging emerging technologies. I highlight for your awareness several actions embedded within these recommendations that appear especially relevant to the subcommittee's mission areas. These include, as you mentioned, amending the Stafford Act to include pandemics, cyber events, and other emergencies of extended duration or nationwide impact. Biennial delivery of a national emergency response strategy by the Secretary of Homeland Security. Establishment of expense reporting authority for all emergency response related spending by the federal government. Redesign of FEMA's National Response Coordination Center to link responder networks and help create a common operating picture for all stakeholders. Wider inclusion of non-traditional partners by the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA in response efforts. Creation of a FEMA Surge Center that can deliver the situational awareness, secure information exchange, and data analytics needed to drive accurate real-time decision-making. Development of a secure national disaster app offering access to features like a map displaying current disaster and response activities, and AI-enabled predictive analytics indicating future threat areas. The acquisition and use of technologies capable of engendering trust in the handling of personal data. Exploration of targeted protection for organizations and businesses asked to share data with governments during time of crisis. Driving IT modernization by federal organizations that are part of the National Response Framework, and migration of state and local legacy systems to new secure platforms capable of integration with those National Response Framework organizations. And finally, establishment of consistent, pervasive exercising across the emergency response enterprise. Joining me today are 3 commission experts with deep subject matter knowledge related to FEMA, to surge and supply activities, and data and technology. They will help answer your questions on these or any other recommendations. And they are former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate, who is involved in aspects of our report related to FEMA, as well as all of the recommendations related to communications and coordination. Christy Rogers, a managing partner at Principal to Principal LLC, who spent considerable time focused on supply and surge and the human resource aspect of our recommendations. And Michael Capps, the CEO of Dive Plane Corporation, who is an expert in leveraging technology. We cannot change what has already occurred, but we can commit ourselves to doing better in the months and years ahead. Ben's hopes that our commission's work can be a blueprint for elevating America's ability to respond to future crises. We stand ready to work with you, the full committee, and all interested representatives and senators in moving the nation forward toward this critical goal. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, General Votel. I'm going to take a minute, too, to recognize the accompanying witnesses with you and just say a little bit about them for the record. I'm very grateful not only to you, General, but to the witnesses you just mentioned for being part of this testimony today. So let me just recognize all three: the Honorable W. Craig Fugate, Ms. Christy Rogers, and Mr. Michael Capps. Mr. Craig Fugate is a former administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, a position he held for nearly 8 years. He previously served at the Director of Florida's Division and is a recognized expert on emergency preparedness and response issues. As a member of the Commission on the National Response Enterprise, Mr. Fugate lent his experience and expertise regarding the federal role in national emergencies, existing gaps, and how to address surge capacity. Ms. Christy Rogers is the managing partner of the consulting firm Principal to Principal, LLC, which advises business executives and leaders. Earlier in her career, she served in several government roles, first at U.S. Customs and Border Protection within DHS, beginning shortly after 9/11, later serving 9 months in Iraq with the Defense Department. As a commissioner, she lent her expertise on a variety of emergency response issues, including supply chain and surge capacity. Mr. Michael Capps is the CEO of Dive Plane Corporation, an artificial intelligence company that works with the Department of Defense. Mr. Capps has taught about artificial intelligence and the use of virtual reality for training at the Naval Postgraduate School. He has extensive experience in the technology sector, including as president or CEO of 3 cutting-edge software companies. As a commissioner, Mr. Capps helped guide work on data and technology use in national crises. Mr. Fugate, Ms. Rogers, and Mr. Capps, I understand you are all prepared to help answer the subcommittee's questions today. I thank you so much for your work and for joining us. We're now going to begin our round of questions, and I've been notified that due to a conflict, it is unlikely that Senator Paul will be able to join us. So I'm going to proceed now to a set of questions, and then after that, I'll recognize Senator Hawley for his. General Votel, while some people associate FEMA with disasters like major storms and wildfires, I know that FEMA, as well as state and local emergency managers, tries to make an all-hazards approach in drills and preparation. But Congress may need to clarify federal law to reflect that all-hazards approach. The Commission's first recommendation includes amending the Stafford Act to include pandemics and cyber attacks for FEMA disaster assistance. So, General, can you tell us why and what would be the practical effect of such a change?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Yes, I think the immediate response would be inclusion of pandemics or these other types of national shocks that we have been talking about would allow for a more rapid distribution and focus of resources, money, and leadership towards the problem. I think one of the things that we discovered in the process of this, because there was some initial confusion in the early days of the pandemic and looking at it as a medical issue, the government initially focused in on medically oriented organizations, Health and Human Services Department, before ultimately assigning the responsibility of this to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And in that time, valuable time was lost in focusing on the problem. So I think the key thing that this amendment does is it provides the opportunity to immediately focus on the emergency and get the necessary resources flowing towards them.
Well, thank you. General, another question. Recent events have highlighted the challenges of stocking, maintaining, and distributing emergency supplies in the Strategic National Stockpile. The Department of Health and Human Services is the lead agency when it comes to management of the Strategic National Stockpile, but should FEMA have a role in coordinating with HHS going forward?
Yes, I think they should through kind of the National Response Coordination Center. FEMA can have some ability in making sure that that we have on hand the appropriate resources to deal with any of these particular emergencies. An important role that FEMA plays in this through things like the NRCC is the ability to have well-established relationships with industry and with other civil organizations out there who are providing the resources for this. So I think it is absolutely critical that that they play in this particular area.
Well, thank you. I want to ask a follow-up here. How can emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence help address these challenges? And certainly if Mr. Capps or Mr. Rogers want to add thoughts about this, that would be great.
So let me jump in here, and then I'll defer to my colleagues here. So I think one of the key things that where artificial intelligence can help us is in the modeling aspect of this. This is another area where the work of the commission identified some challenges here in trusting models that can be used to help predict what is happening. All of us are aware with hurricanes and other natural disasters, we have become very confident in the models that are used by the National Weather Service and others to predict landfalls and all that, where all that takes place, so that people can get out of the way, they can prepare, we can have the necessary resources ready to go. We are thinking about it in both time and space. And so I think one of the things that technology can help do, particularly artificial intelligence, is help fill that gap as we look at some of these other disasters. And I'll defer to Mike and others to comment.
Thank you, General, and thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I look at AI as both a defensive concern as well as a capability, right? In that we need to make sure that our data, our systems, our cloud are operational, because we can't maintain an economy or resilience without them. But then looking to what they can do for us, it's just impossible to tabletop all the scenarios with people around the table in the way that you can do with AI. So building models and then building resilient models is a real opportunity. When we were working on this commission, we thought of issues like Katrina and how difficult it is to know where are people and what needs to be where. And if you imagine, if we just simply knew where every operating IoT internet-enabled refrigerator was in Louisiana, what that could have done for us. But that's information you need to gather in advance, which is exactly what the sort of partnerships we're proposing might be able to do. Thank you.
And I assume artificial intelligence and technology can help us keep track of what we have in the National Strategic Stockpile, for example, and again, match supplies to need in a much more efficient way.
Sure. Absolutely. That's just the tracking problem. It's interesting how hard it is to know what's on what truck and where. But that's the sort of thing that, again, with IT modernization efforts across government and partnering with private enterprise, it's the sort of thing we could do. And having a real situational picture is the first step towards prioritizing response.
Great. Ms. Rogers, do you want to add? I wanted to also add about data collection and analysis in terms of identifying where distribution needs are the greatest. So if you wanted to address that, or just generally the use of other technologies, that would be helpful.
I do. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, again, for the opportunity to speak today and the recognition for this important issue. I'll take a bit of what General Votel said in regards to the Commission's recommendation to create, or actually I would say transform, evolve FEMA's National Response Coordination Center and make it a permanent state-of-the-art organization that could be an interagency organization, meaning it could coordinate or should coordinate directly with the Strategic National Stockpile, with HHS, CDC, FDA, and BARDA all within it. But we need one organization that is responsible for the preparedness planning and response. And that is important to deliver consistent information on supply demand to the private sector. A lot of companies stepped up and wanted to help, but weaknesses in supply and demand signaling by the federal government and the lack of a coordinated, consistent voice by the government to the private sector really hampered the production and the delivery of much needed PPE, medical equipment, and pharmaceuticals. If the surge center, as we are recommending for FEMA, could also be housed in the National Response Coordination Center, and it would be state of the art, completely digitalized, allowing the secure sharing of information between the government and private sector. And it would allow a clear demand signal to be provided to the government, so companies would know what they needed to ramp up in production, when to deliver, and where to deliver.
Well, thank you. And before I turn it over to Senator Hawley, I just wanted to ask Mr. Fugate, since we got into some of his expertise, area of expertise, whether he has anything to add on this particular topic.
No, again, Madam Chair, talking about AI, talking about data, this always goes back to the question that we also talk about in the report is we have to have production capacity within the United States when we're dealing with global threats. One of our big challenges in supply chain is even knowing where stuff is, if it isn't being produced in the U.S., we may not be able to get it fast enough.
Great. Thank you so much. And now to Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. General Votel, let me turn back to you. It's nice to see you again in a somewhat different capacity than when I saw you last before the Senate Armed Services Committee. But let me ask you about this report. Just on the subject of supply chains, what do you think that we should learn from the pandemic about the vulnerability of our critical supply chains in particular?
Thank you, Senator, and it's good to see you again. I think the most important point is we have to come to some resolution on what it is that we need to have stockpiled, and what those essential resources and supplies are that we need to have stockpiled, of course, and ready to go. And then we need to make sure that we know where those things come from, and what the supply chains are associated with those, and where there are dependencies that lead us overseas, or where our production capacities are within the United States that can be invoked to address those. So I really think this gets down to overall awareness and understanding of what we are going to have on hand, and then how we reach out and grab the things that we need as a crisis emerges.
Let me ask you about the just-in-time production. It seems to me that one of the weaknesses with our supply chains is this just-in-time production model and other efficiency measures that, while they no doubt help the corporate bottom line, also can leave us vulnerable and exposed in a crisis, as we saw this last year. You talk about this a little bit in the report, I believe. I wondered if you could just discuss the problem, some of the problems with the private sector's emphasis on just-in-time production as it relates to the national response enterprise.
Sure, Senator. So the real challenge here is that when we do just-in-time supply, what that means is that the initial surge of capabilities that we need early in a crisis to respond and bring things under control may not be immediately available to us. And of course, this is the challenge. And so what is needed is there is more coordination and discussion between those at the federal and perhaps state level who are managing these stockpiles, and those who are producing the items that go into them. And we will need to accept the fact that we have to work very closely with businesses to provide, have stuff on hand, rotated in and out of stockage so that it stays up to date, and that the businesses will have arrangements that they aren't doing this at a loss to their bottom line. So there has to be much closer coordination over this particular issue right here. It's absolutely critical, especially in the early stages of a crisis.
Let me ask you about the responsibilities that our largest corporations have when it comes to this issue, and in particular, supply chain resilience. So, for example, what I'm thinking of is if we have a major corporation that produce certain essential goods, like medical devices, for instance, should they be required to take steps to boost supply chain resilience, onshore jobs back domestically, report on where they source their products, things of that nature, given the fact that we rely on these products so much, these essential products?
Thanks, Senator. I'd invite Ms. Rogers to comment on this as well. But I think, yes, I think we have to, for these organizations, private sector organizations that we rely on for these critical resources, they need to be incentivized and encouraged to make sure that we know with some level of reliability that we can get our hands on those particular supplies.
Yeah, Senator, and if I may address that in two different ways. You are correct that resiliency in companies today often means sort of idle capacity, which is the antithesis of a lean, efficient, profitable business model. But I don't think you have to do away with that, actually. With today's innovative technologies, the widespread adoption of them could actually build in resiliency. The adoption of 3D printing, of digital twin, of additional AI and other data sharing, that could allow a surge capacity without delayed time and still allowing a company to be profitable. You could further enhance that, as the general said, with a combination of incentives. And I would say it's sort of modern day public-private partnership. The private sector has the innovation, the ingenuity, and the wherewithal to be able to do this. What the government needs is to create a path to allow those companies that want to help in the state of a crisis to do so. And it could be a combination of tax incentives, of grants. It just depends upon the size of a company and what a company needs. A smaller company might need access to capital, so it could be also a loan. So I would say it needs to be a combination of integrating state-of-the-art technology along with tax incentives, grants, and loans to the private sector.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Rogers, for that. Thank you, General. General, let me switch to FEMA, if I could, for a minute. FEMA, of course, took a major role in procuring and distributing PPE during the early stages of the pandemic, including Project Airbridge, which arranged air transport for PPE from other countries. How would you assess FEMA's role in that operation?
Well, again, I think perhaps Mr. Fugate can provide some more expert information on this. But in my view, what FEMA encompasses here is the expertise and the management skills to deal with crises. So I think their role in this early on is absolutely essential. And as we've seen, they end up being an organization that becomes a go-to for many of the crises that our country faces. Craig, thoughts, please?
Yeah, thanks, Senator. They did what they had to do. I think our concern on the commission was it was late to need. It wasn't clear that FEMA had this role. And prior planning, we had focused on FEMA's role in supporting the governors as the consequences of a pandemic, with HHS having the primary lead on supply chain, distribution, acquisition. And so I think, as we pointed out, clarifying these roles now, that FEMA does have a role supporting HHS. These are things that FEMA would likely be called upon. I think even improves that capability and speeds it up so it's not late in the inning before they're being utilized.
Very good. Well, thank you all. I've got some more questions I'll submit for the record, but thank you for your work and thank you for being here. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. And just as we look at timing, there will likely be an opportunity for second round of questions as well, just for everybody's awareness. But now I want to move to Senator Cassidy, who is joining us as a special guest because of his role with BENS over the last several months.
Yeah, I'm not on the committee, so they're allowing me to join from my kitchen. So anyway, thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, BENS, for all the work you've done. I got so many questions. Let me just start, though, with you, Mr. Fugate. Building upon that last line of questioning. When everything hit the fan, my appropriations guy said there's no way FEMA doesn't take the lead because they have to dispense a lot of money very quickly, and HHS does not have the infrastructure to do that. And then I was speaking to a doctor involved with disposition of ventilators. HHS had that expertise, but FEMA took it over because, as I gather, because they were now writing the checks. They may have come late to the game, but they were dominating the game. And so they were now making decisions, which frankly, they didn't have the training to do. So there's been some kind of, well, we need to build out HHS so they can dispense lots of money quickly. But that seems like we should be able to concentrate that in one agency, not duplicating both. On the other hand, you don't want FEMA making decisions about healthcare when it's just some guy who slept in a Holiday Inn last night. So how do we reconcile those two sorts of tensions, those tensions?
It's going back to FEMA's classic role, Senator. FEMA's a support agency. They're not the lead agency. They support governors in most disasters, or in the case of a lead federal agency like HHS, where HHS is in charge of the response. But FEMA has a convening power. It has tools under the Stafford Act. It has capabilities to support that. It wasn't much different than our role in supporting the Center for Disease Control during Ebola. We didn't take over that response, but we sent teams in to help CDC staff their EOC.
Now, can I ask you just kind of a group dynamic question? Because it does seem as if somebody has the convening power and somebody has the ability to dispense dollars all over the nation and somebody, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that whether or not they are technically supporting, in reality, they begin to assume responsibility of leadership. Is that, you've been there. I've been in the middle of a hurricane hitting Louisiana, and it does seem at some point the federal role becomes pretty prominent in terms of direction of activity. So I know that's how it's on paper. It didn't seem to work out that way. That may have been an internal dynamic within the administration. Is it possible for FEMA to only be supporting when they have such a prominent role otherwise?
Absolutely. Again, FEMA had a prominent role in responding to the hurricanes in Louisiana, coordinating the federal response, but the lead was always the governor of Louisiana. And I think that's the thing we missed when the decision was made to put FEMA in charge of the response was I wouldn't have done that. I would have kept HHS or Health and Human Services in charge of the medical, the decisions, the policies, but I would have tasked FEMA for coordinating with the rest of the federal family, where they have a lot of built deep relationships to support that, and then focus on supporting the governors on a lot of the consequences. And again, we've looked at this in a variety of types of emergencies that fall out of that traditional governors, state-led, FEMA-supported, where there's a federal lead agency. And again, there's always going to be personalities, but I think the role of FEMA is as the support agency, the support element to that lead role, whatever federal agency it is. And that it's personality sometimes, but I think codifying that structurally in statute, the Stafford Act, and other ways can also ensure that FEMA has that role, is called in early, but it's a support to that lead federal agency.
Okay, Ms. Rogers, there's been a couple questions here regarding inventory management. Now, we know the private sector will often use vendor managed inventory, first in, first out, that sort of thing. And we heard stories of the strategic national supplies inventory declining, having obsolete equipment or stuff that was just on the brink of being expired. Nothing that should happen in a well-run major hospital. That would have been used before it expired. Any thoughts regarding a vendor-managed inventory to manage our nation's stockpile? And just for context, the buyer owns the inventory, but there is a vendor which manages the inventory without taking possession. So I'm asking you on that.
No, I mean, I think a vendor-managed inventory would be an exceptional way to go. I think there needs to be increased visibility in the strategic national stockpile and in the state stockpiles. I mean, I think it's critical, and I do think it is something, as the commission recommended, sort of a surge center that would have visibility and coordinate with the strategic national stockpile understanding what the supply is, and also at the same time maintaining a sort of 24/7 visibility on the supply and the demand. Not just during a crisis, right? But it's most important to actually do it ahead of time so you have that visibility and you're able to do much better manage the first in, first out, what's needed. And then, of course, combining the latest technological innovations. We've just not done that. If you actually look at the Strategic National Stockpile and what digital twin technology and 3D printing could do, to dramatically improve the response capability and capacity of the SNS would be incredible.
You know, let me ask you though, I think of 3D printing as being kind of a one-off, not the sort of surge in supply we needed for ventilators, or at least we thought we needed for ventilators. Am I wrong? Can 3D printing actually give you that volume of, you name it, say ventilators, pretty complex, et cetera?
Yeah, we've worked with several companies, small and large, including some of the largest companies, right? Like Siemens Government Technology, 3M, General Motors, Ford, with some of the small ventilator companies. And the biggest concern with the company that has the technology, like producing the ventilator, is the proprietary information. So once you deal with the proprietary information and maybe license the technology, the 3D printing as well as the digital twin can actually greatly enhance and strengthen the volume and capacity.
Can you give me a sense of how many ventilators you can make with, I mean, do we have to build out our 3D manufacturing capacity, or is there right now the ability to make, 10,000 ventilators in a week using 3D printing?
I would say yes and yes. We do need to enhance and strengthen, and yes, we currently have the capacity. 3M was building ventilators. I'm going to get this, let's say in a month, 300,000 on a normal basis pre-COVID. And they were, during the height of COVID, it was up to 10 million, 300 million, and it vastly enhanced their capability when they looked at implementing the digital twin and the 3D printing.
Gotcha. I'll have a second round, but I see Senator Rosen's on, so I will log off for a second.
Thank you very much, Senator Cassidy. I now recognize Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator Cassidy, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today and for your service. I'm going to talk a little bit about coordinating with non-traditional partners, particularly as it relates to natural disasters, because in 2020, the wildfire season was incredibly devastating, burning more than 10 million acres nationally and hundreds of thousands of acres in my home state of Nevada. As communities continue to recover from COVID and natural disasters like wildfires, we have to provide the support and the investments to prevent further catastrophes. So for wildfires in Nevada, various stakeholders coordinate response and recovery efforts. They include our federal land management agencies, state and local governments, first responders. And one of the report's recommendations is to expand the inclusion of non-traditional partners when responding to incidents. In Nevada, farmers, ranchers, conservation groups, they play a key role in defending against wildfire and recovering the lands after, but they're not always brought to the table. So, Mr. Fugate, how can FEMA and the federal government expand outreach to these kind of non-traditional partners, encourage the kind of collaboration we need, particularly for us in Nevada, the West Coast, we have wildfires, but other natural disaster responses even more broadly?
Well, Senator, this is something I came to the conclusion a long time ago, that government-centric problem solving doesn't scale up the bigger the disaster is. And we developed the term whole of the community and looked at the public as a resource and not a liability. How do you bring in those non-traditional folks that are on the ground that are going to take action anyway? And there's a bias in the federal government not to engage outside those partnerships. And I think, at FEMA, we just had to make the disasters big enough to break the system to force people into those relationships. So I think, again, as we talk about the pandemic and we saw how that introduced new partners, it is a bias that the federal government has to get through, is that you don't have to always be the traditional organization. You don't have to have the incident command certification. We spend a lot of time talking about credentialing, but in a disaster, it's who's going to show up and work that we need to be looking at. So I think part of this is lower the barriers to the public and to those non-traditional folks to be part of the team.
Yeah, I agree. And could you speak to the, I would think that there might be potential cost savings and really proactive efficiencies when you strengthen these relationships. For example, farmers and ranchers, they could be doing things ahead of time to mitigate. Of course, in the case of wildfires, you can do some mitigation, maybe other things not so much. But do you think there's cost savings there for the efficiencies to be found?
There's cost savings and it speeds up response. But if you go into the wildfire community, they're traditionally not going to be very receptive to people who don't have their training, aren't part of their system. They are very much focused on their safety and working with people they're comfortable with. That is when you have enough resources. When you don't have enough resources, who are you going to call? And, I grew up and I live in the state of Florida, and I can tell you a lot of our brush fires here, it's a farmer with a tractor and a disc plow out there cutting a fire break.
Right.
So I know that works. I think it's the question of how do we bring this from the one-offs to systemically in the federal government recognizing the public is a resource in a crisis, not a liability, and how do we engage them more effectively?
I agree with you there. I want to turn and build on this subject in our cybersecurity arena. So, of course, speaking of non-traditional partners, we have to think about that in cybersecurity as well. So I'm particularly concerned that the federal government, of course, alone can't secure our critical infrastructure from the evolving, the increasingly complex cyber threats that we have. So to General Botel and then Ms. Rogers, how do you think the federal government can expand the partnerships and information sharing with the companies that possess the cybersecurity knowledge and experience to better protect us all and kind of create that grid, if you will, of security?
Thank you, Senator. I really like this discussion we're having about the non-traditional partners. This is really, really important. And what the commission recommends here is that we look and organize to make sure that we have a point of contact for businesses in things like the National Response Coordination Center. That they can reach out there to link into them. And I think what we have recognized throughout the pandemic is that while we have a tendency to think about the traditional private sector that we would go out to, in many cases, as you just highlighted, there are parts of the private sector that are not normally considered, but are, of course, very key to this. And cybersecurity is absolutely essential to this. So I agree with the assessment that you're laying out here, and I think maybe Christy or Mike Capps can add some additional details to this particular area.
Thanks, Senator. I appreciate the question on this. And if I may just add a little bit of context, because my answer will make more sense. Just after 9/11, I was brought into Department of Transportation to work with New York City's Metropolitan Transit Authority on response. I then went to Department of Defense and was in Iraq working on a contingency operation, then Homeland Security at Customs and Border Protection during SARS and Hurricane Katrina, directly involved. My two companies in which I was CEO after, one was a contingency operation company helping the government emergency response. And the last one was we ran 9 Ebola treatment units in Sierra Leone and Liberia. So I have a different perspective on government response and preparedness. And a unfortunate reoccurring theme in all of those has been the government's inability to reach out and grab non-traditional partners. Because it's not as though the partners that, the private sector, civil society doesn't want to participate and help, they do. One of the things that I will add is in what we call phase 0, in the planning and preparation phase of any crisis, bring in private sector, bring in civil society to help prepare, help respond. So they're not caught off guard. So it's an integrated a systemic response. Furthermore, and you saw this in COVID, So often, there are several examples where U.S. manufacturers volunteered to address needs, but could not get a go or no-go decision from the government. There wasn't one single authority responsible, and two, the contracting processes didn't exist. So I would further recommend, and the commission further recommends, implementing executive emergency purchase orders, issue predefined or indefinite delivery, indefinite quality, quantity federal contracts, or also issue blanket purchase agreements in the time of non-crisis, which means you issue a contract to, let's say, 7 companies you identify. You award a nominal fee annually to those companies just to hold the capacity and capability in times of a crisis.
I think that's very informative, and I'll need IT modernization to do a lot of this. I look forward to talking with you about that too. Thank you. My time's expired.
Well, thank you, Senator Rosen. I'm going to go ahead and start a second round of questions, and I think we may have one other senator who wants to do the same after I finish my second round. So I think the first thing I want to ask is, in this last set of questions, General Votel, you and the panel have been asked generally about supply chain. I want to drill down on that a little bit and just give you all an opportunity to add anything you haven't said and then move on to a couple other topics. So early in the pandemic, the supply chain issues regarding certain items needed amid the pandemic reinforced what many of us already knew, that the United States was overly reliant on Chinese manufactured goods. So, General Votel, how can we reduce U.S. reliance on Chinese goods before or during the next national crisis?
Certainly this is something that the commission looked at, as you know, Madam Chair, and I think the answer is, I think, lies in making the deliberate decisions about where we are getting our supplies from, and understanding exactly what the supply chains are. The idea that we talked about within the commission is the idea of right shoring, that there are some dependencies that we do have overseas that are okay to maintain. Obviously, there's real concerns with China, but we also are very dependent on a number of our other international partners for these things, who are fairly reliable in terms of delivering supplies to us. So I think it is absolutely critical to understand where our supply chains lead us, and what we need to have on hand to address the initial response to these types of emergencies.
Well, thank you. Ms. Rogers, you addressed this at a certain level, and so did you, General Votel, but we obviously need to know where our critical assets are in the supply chain during an emergency. So we also acknowledged, and you've testified about, the high levels of stress that the pandemic put on different parts of several supply chains. So I'll start with you, General, and then the rest of the panelists can add if they would like to. How can we improve the government's visibility into the nation's supply chains? You've all talked about it a little bit, but I just want to give you a chance to expand on it if you'd like to.
Yeah, one of the recommendations that we make is the establishment of a national disaster app that is kind of an opt-in ability that gives people, particularly private sector, really all stakeholders, civil society as well, an opportunity to see how a crisis is developing, what the future looks like for that, and then the ability to share data with government partners here to understand where supplies may be and how they may be applied to the situation. As a military man, in looking at this, the development of a common operating picture of how we are looking at the crisis is absolutely essential in this, and this is absolutely critical when it comes to both maintenance of our supplies and surge capacity, which essentially is getting the right tools to the right place at the right time. And so the establishment of a common operating picture through a redesigned National Response Coordination Center, the establishment of an app to which stakeholders can opt in, I think are two very, very critical recommendations that the Commission makes that will help go a long way towards this.
Great, thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to add anything?
Sure, I will. Just briefly, I think with this newly redesigned National Response Coordination Center, whether it is within FEMA or within DHS, it needs to be one responsible, accountable body. And the first step I would say is that we do need to review and make clear to all parties what the critical goods are. What is a critical good and what are critical infrastructure, and then work backwards in that supply chain and see where the supply chain is. Right. If a large portion of the critical goods supply chain is in China, then we need to look at a strategy to reshore some of it, and that might include incentivizing some of these companies. It could be reshoring domestically, or it could actually also mean reshoring it to an allied nation. So that I think that is critical, because regional diversification, whether it's regional domestically or regional amongst our allied nations, will further strengthen the resiliency of our supply chains, especially in a crisis. But I think I do think that a surge center or this national response coordination center needs to have sort of state-of-the-art supply chain asset mapping capability. And it could be then downloaded to a digital app. But yeah. I think one of the first steps in the preparation and planning stage is it needs to map our supply chain assets. We've not done that. We don't know where they are and where our vulnerabilities are.
Thank you. Let me quickly move to one other and maybe two other issues before I turn to Senator Ossoff, who has joined us for a first round of questions. General Votel, the Commission proposes the creation of a leadership position within the Department of Homeland Security to oversee the development of a national crisis response exercise framework. How would this build upon the existing national exercise program at FEMA?
Thank you. It's an excellent question, Madam Chair. The idea here is to put leaders in charge of our exercises and our response planning, and there's no more definitive way of doing that than actually to have somebody that is held accountable for that can work across the the organizations in the national response framework and bring them together to participate in exercises and rehearse plans that are in place, but also has the ability to compel leadership to participate in this. Oftentimes, what we see in these instances is that we have mid-level staff participating in these, but not the leaders who are going to be making decisions. And so adding leadership into this and creation of this position, I think, gives us the best ability to really focus in on this critical task that is so important for the preparation of the nation for these disasters.
So it's the right stakeholders as well as the leadership of those stakeholders.
That's exactly right. It's getting everybody, getting all the right organizations, and then getting the participation at the right level of leadership that is going to be involved in making decisions in an actual emergency.
Thank you very much. I am over my time, and I'll now recognize Senator Ossoff for his first round of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the panel for your work preparing these recommendations for the committee and for Congress. General Votel, I want to ask you about financial infrastructure and resilience in a crisis. We saw during this COVID-19 pandemic that the provision of emergency and swift financial support directly to households has been vital to sustaining an economy that was crippled by all of the mitigation measures that were necessarily implemented in response to the pandemic. Did your working group consider what changes may need to be made to our payments infrastructure or to our macroeconomic policymaking apparatus so that in a future crisis, whether a pandemic or some other contingency, if we need to swiftly get financial support directly to households rather than via the banking system, we can do so more efficiently?
Senator, the the aspect that we addressed in this was not necessarily focused on the amounts and that type of stuff, but it really was focused on the technology and the reliance in getting those payments to families. So in the event that we don't have the right databases, we don't have the right technology to move this very, very quickly to these resources to where they need to be, this was an area of some focus for us, and where we did make some specific recommendations, particularly as we looked at leveraging technology to help do this. I mean, it's one thing for the administration and Congress to authorize payments, is another thing to make sure that those payments actually get to the recipients who need it in a timely fashion. And in this particular area, this is where technology can help us do this much faster and make sure that it gets to the targeted individuals who and families and others who require these payments.
Thank you, General. And in the event of a crisis or an attack which undermines the integrity of our telecommunications infrastructure or our financial system, particularly our payments infrastructure, what recommendations do you present for improving both the resilience but also the redundancy of those core systems?
Thank you, Senator. The report talks about making use of multi-cloud technologies that are available to us today to help build resiliency into our overall system of storing data and then relying on that data at a particular time in the crisis. So there are a variety of technologies that are available out there that will actually help us do this, and will actually build some of a level of robustness into this. I might invite Mr. Capps to comment on this, since the technology area was an area in which he focused specifically in on during this commission.
I'm happy to, General. Thank you, Senator, for the question. I would say that decentralization is critical for resilience, and decentralization requires the modernization across state, local, federal government. And I don't think we're on the path to that. You look to the last infrastructure protection plan was in 2015, maybe, and cloud is mentioned as a future exercise of investigation. But every one of the services that we're talking about are completely built upon data lakes that are in the cloud, right? So there's no notion of infrastructure resilience for the cloud. It's not part of the current mission. AI and ML aren't even mentioned anywhere on the CISA website. I mean, CISA is a fantastic organization. They work hard, but it's not part of their mission. And so I think we've got a lot of basic work to do to catch up to where private enterprise is first, before we start thinking about the next steps of how would we handle black sky post a well-built cyber defense.
Thank you. Mr. Capps, while I've got you, any recommendations, or I would even invite speculation beyond the constraints of this report with respect to how mobile technology might have multi-band capacity in the event the predominant cell networks are deteriorated, and any comments on whether or not we need to enhance satellite communication capacity, the ability to use satellite links to generate more local networks, either via the cell system or Wi-Fi networks or mesh networks, so that we can have decentralized, effective communication in the event that some of the centers of our telecommunications network are degraded?
Well, sir, that's a wide question. And I'll say that, I think we're seeing civilian advances in satellite communication. 5G is nothing but resilient. It's meant to have machine learning right in the radio centers so that it can adapt anytime systems go down. And you'll see this migration to mesh networks. When you think of Internet of Things devices, within a few years, we'll be to a million-ish devices on network per square kilometer in urban centers. And so if you think of the pure availability of radios, our job is going to be, let's make sure those devices are secure, which there's really no handling of that right now, which I could go into detail on if you'd like. And then open networks for 5G, like O-RAN, that allow devices to plug and play together. It's all about interface and letting them to communicate with each other so that they can be resilient. And then as we transition to edge computing, which is we've got cloud at the edge, that's going to allow that small town in North Carolina to be able to be completely severed from Amazon Web Services or whatever else, but still have plenty of data locally, plenty of computation locally, and be able to be functional if they need to be in a decentralized manner.
Thank you. And I would invite, I think you touched upon this briefly, or at least referenced it, any comments or observations, conclusions, recommendations you have with respect to encryption on prevailing communications networks. And also, are there any lessons that should be drawn from the recent SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange server breaches that touch upon some of the recommendations in the report, please? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would start with, sorry, getting some cross-channel here. I would start with cyberspace as a sovereign entity, right? That's something that's difficult for us in the United States to think about. You know, we grew up with the internet as a public space, but our competitors treat cyberspace as sovereign for their nations. You know, we like to joke in the IT industry that if guys with guns show up at the front door, then there will be somebody on our side to defend us. But if Russians attack or Chinese attack or North Koreans attack the website, which does even for my small AI company, I get 30,000 attacks a day. I get warnings from CISA letting me know that I might be attacked, but there's no notion of defending critical infrastructure. So I think that's sort of step one is how do we take, we can't treat our companies as a critical part of resilience for the national enterprise and also assume that they can take care of themselves. That's a bad combination.
Thank you. Thank you all for your testimony. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
First round of questions. Do we have Senator Scott? If not, I see Senator Cassidy on my screen. So, Senator Cassidy, I'll recognize you for your second round of questions.
Yeah, I'll start with you again, Ms. Rogers, just regarding the supply chain. Now, there's been interest in the administration and in the Senate to reshore some things that we found were embargoed for shipment to the United States when the pandemic began in China, for example. N95 mask made by 3M, by force majeure, the Chinese decided not to allow to be shipped to us. But we have to recognize that some of this being manufactured depends upon a low labor cost in order for it to be otherwise marketable, not just during the pandemic, but also, you know, in normal times. If we have a pandemic every decade, which is far more than we've currently been having it, we may have a stranded asset in the 10 years between, by which point the manufacturing equipment is outdated. Now, one thing I've been interested in is if you know, there's a question of reshoring and nearshoring. If we had some of this placed in a low-cost country, for example, Central America, Mexico, in which the PPE was made there, or some other product made there, we would have the advantage of not having to cross an ocean, but you would have something that could remain competitive selling as goods in the interim. Any thoughts upon that?
I agree. I mean, it's first, I think I'm going back to we need to be clear on what we deem a critical good, depending on which crisis. And then we need to look at where those supply chains are and where they're manufactured. And we need to, when we do that and we say it's a critical good, it's manufactured in a non-allied country, we need to implement strategies. And that might be incentivizing the company to reshore or nearshore. And Mexico, Central America, great options. There are also some, you know, Far East, Near East that are also other options that are allies. But I think we really need to be clear on what the critical goods are. And when we talk about incentivizing companies to do this, we need to recognize that there are a lot of government obstacles and impediments and regulations that have forced companies overseas to produce these goods. So that needs to be a recognition on behalf of the federal government. I mean, the companies are looking at their bottom line saying we need to produce this for the US. And if these are US companies, they want to help the US. There's no doubt about that. And I've seen that throughout COVID. But they also need to sort of protect their bottom line and ensure they're still in business. And there are a lot of bureaucracies and regulations in place that impede some of the reshoring.
I agree with that. By the way, I think I know during the Cold War that NATO or NATO allies, there was a distribution of essential materials so that in every country there was something. But we didn't have to depend upon a non-NATO ally for penicillin, for example. I bring up penicillin because right now, so-called beta-lactam drugs, which penicillin is one of, so essential, is only produced in China. And I'm told that creating a strategic stockpile of the active pharmaceutical ingredient is just not practical. But I'm also told that companies don't like to make it in the United States because it involves fermentation, and that in turn brings EPA upon them in a way which is onerous to comply with. I'm not saying other countries like Mexico have a lower standard, but I think the company may be more comfortable producing a fermented product in a country like Mexico as they currently apparently are in China. Now, China greatly subsidizes this industry. So you already have a lower cost basis because they have a state subsidy. Are you suggesting, and just to be explicit, that we may consider doing a U.S. subsidy for a manufacturing facility that would be built not in the United States, but in a near shore country?
I would emphasize may. You may consider it. I would weigh the cost option of doing that. I think I'll give you an example. In Ireland right now, there are numerous companies, pharmaceuticals and medical manufacturing, that have deemed it less expensive and cost prohibitive to have their plants in Ireland. Ireland is now sending 20 flights a day to the US with no passengers, but full of supply. That is an allied country that we are relying on for supply, and US companies that are actually have their manufacturing plants there. That's not been subsidized. So we.
Yeah, but there must be some reason for it. There must be a lower cost of doing
Yes,
business.
it is.
And what is the source of that lower cost of doing business? Tax code?
It's tax code, EPA regulations primarily.
So if we're saying tax code, just taking you someplace you may not want to go, but knowing that the administration currently wants to raise corporate tax rates, you're implicitly stating that they may indeed drive companies to move operations out of the United States elsewhere, if that were the case?
That would be counterproductive to our recommendations on increasing resiliency and surge capacity in the U.S., correct?
Well, that's very interesting. And also, you mentioned the EPA, but I still think of the EU as having fairly stringent, in some cases more stringent than we, environmental regulations. And so it isn't just the regulation you're implying, but it's also the means of enforcement and/or penalty. Is that something I can take from your statement? I'm getting you in trouble here, maybe, Ms. Rogers.
You could, and I could get you specific examples, but I'm not prepared to name those companies now.
I got that, but you can give me specific examples with a little preparation in terms of how it's not just the regulation, but it's the otherwise enforcement.
I could do that.
Okay, that's good. And then, Mr. Capps, you in the report they speak of a distributed ledger blockchain. I'm interested in distributed ledger in a variety of ways. Can you explain how we would be able to use that to better manage pandemic response or any other kind of natural disaster or man-made disaster response?
Well, sure. Distributed ledgers, I mean, all it is a notebook that everyone has a copy of and that you can trust it. And so when we were speaking earlier to Senator Ossoff's question about decentralization, if everyone's got a full copy of every, let's say, procurement contract that's been related to PPE, everyone's got it and they all know where the information, where the material is. And then we have some event that pinches you off from the rest of the network. You've still got all the information you need and it's a trustworthy copy.
So let me interrupt you for a second.
Just about that.
When the pandemic hit, New Orleans was getting slammed and Los Angeles was wide open, but there was a nationwide shutdown of elective surgery. I got a call from anesthesiologist saying, I can't believe there's a shortage of machines. I got 100 machines no one's using. yeah, they're anesthesia, but you could still use them for general if you had to. But we also have general anesthesia machines. We could ship them to New Orleans and then get them back when inevitably you go down there and we go up here. But no one had a nationwide inventory of this. But on the other hand, if we use blockchain for such an inventory, it would have to be low cost, easily done, with minimal friction cost, and still protect proprietary information. You're the expert. Is it possible that we can have such a national inventory such as that? Low cost, minimal friction, protecting proprietary information?
And I'm going to ask you to be fairly
Well,
quick
it's a
in your
big question you're
response,
asking,
please.
and it kind of depends on what is within the purview of that. If we're just talking about anesthesia devices nationwide, that feels like the sort of thing to be quite tackleable. If you're talking about any resource in the United States and what it can be applied to, obviously that's very hard. But the notion of this is a trusted system, data is encrypted, so I can't access the information until there's some key given. Everyone's got a copy of it, and we're not spending tons of energy burning a blockchain to do it. Yes, those are totally solvable problems. And you see it in supply chain management in private enterprise all the time. It all comes down to, can I ask you some simple questions and get a simple answer? Not unlike these hearings, sir, where if you can do that, you can get a lot done quickly. And that's exactly how the web works. And there's no reason this couldn't work the same way.
I yield back. Thank you for your indulgence, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. Senator Scott?
All right. First, I want to thank Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Portman for holding this hearing today. General Vogel, in an op-ed in December, Director Ratcliffe declared China to be our #1 national security threat. On his first day of office, President Biden revoked an order blocking Chinese components in the U.S. power grid. It seems like this would be a dangerous door to open to communist China and poses an unnecessary risk to our critical infrastructure and nation security. Do you think Chinese components should be allowed to be used in the U.S. power grid, or should this decision be revoked?
Senator, thank you very much. My view is we are accepting unnecessary risk by incorporating Chinese components into things that we depend upon for our citizens, and especially for things that we depend upon for emergency response. So yes, I think it's a great vulnerability for us.
What do you think about the idea that we all need to understand, every American needs to understand the risk of communist China, whether it's they're stealing our jobs or technology, they're building a military to dominate us, they're taking away the basic rights of Hong Kong citizens and imprisoning Uyghurs. What do you think of the idea that all Americans ought to just say, look, the Communist Party of China has decided to become our enemy, not our adversary. And all of us need to say we're going to stop buying Chinese products. It's a national security threat from the standpoint if they can be in our power grid. But on top of that, it's a national security threat if they continue to build an economy to use those dollars to ultimately dominate Americans.
Senator, this topic is a little bit beyond what the commission addressed, but I would share with you is that I agree with you. Yeah, it is important for American citizens, American business to understand exactly what is at stake in this competition that we have with China, and that their very aggressive, centralized approach that they execute to things like the Belt and Road Initiative and some of the predatory practices that they impose on other countries around the world to gain resources is in fact a threat to our national security. So I think it is absolutely vital that all American citizens in the private sector, public sector, and in the civil sector understand what is at stake with respect to our competition with China.
Thank you. Thank you, General. Last year, I introduced the American-Made Protection for Healthcare Workers and First Responders Act to ensure the United States builds its stockpile of personal protective equipment so our first responders and healthcare workers have everything they need to keep everybody safe from COVID-19 or the next pandemic. I think we ought to focus on making them, American-made products. So what do you think about the need to build an American-made stockpile and also put ourselves in position that American companies have the ability to ramp up when we have the next pandemic?
Thanks, Senator. As we've discussed a little bit previously, I think it's really important that we understand what are the critical resources, what are the critical supplies that we must have on hand. And then once we identify what those are, then we have to look at the sources of those. And certainly we have to be very, very careful about dependencies on countries like China for critical resources that we need in terms of an emergency. And we need to look at where those supply chains go, producing them in the United States or perhaps producing them in friendly allied countries are certainly options that we ought to look at in this. But I absolutely agree with you, and the report recommends that we look very, very closely at where these supply chains take us, particularly with these critical resources that we need in times of emergency.
We've seen Russia and we've seen Communist China try to steal sensitive data. What do you think our federal government ought to be doing in conjunction with our business community to make sure that we deal with our biggest cyber threat, which I think clearly part of it's Russia, but I think with the economy that China is building, it appears to me to be our biggest threat will continue to be China.
Senator, I'd invite Mr. Capps to address this as well, but what I would just say to you is that we should look at these as serious threats, that we would protect our borders from these type of things, and there needs to be more focus from the federal government in helping protect some of our private companies and the data and the technology that they have.
Yes, sir, I'd agree with that. I think the notion of protecting our private enterprises, some of our most valuable assets are exactly there. I worry about us not taking the time now and the massive expense it will take to reshore technology like, let's say, Internet of Things, right? If we allow China to keep making that at cheaper rates, selling it cheaply in the United States, they're just getting better and better and better. So we can argue about who's got the better position in artificial intelligence or computing. Doesn't matter. Their velocity is faster than ours. They're putting 1.4 trillion into networks and AI over a 6-year period. So we will fall behind as long as we are sending our money to them for innovation. And that's something we're going to have to solve. It's a very big problem.
What do you think of that? What do you think about the idea? It might be outside your purview, but I have a bill that requires companies like Amazon and other online resellers to disclose country of origin, because there's Americans are fed up with China. If you look at the national polls now, people realize what China is doing, but companies like Amazon will not disclose where the country of origin of products are, so it makes it very difficult when you're buying a product to know where it's from. And when we buy products from China, we just keep building their economies so they can use it to eventually to dominate us. So what do you think about?
Well, it's of course outside of my technical expertise area, but I absolutely agree with the notion of disclosure. As a small business, I need to know who I feel comfortable taking money from, and finding the Chinese LPs that are supporting that venture capital firm that are the ones that are funding my company is nearly impossible. And the same issue happens with provenance of data. Where did it come from? Was that gathered in a responsible manner that we feel fits our the way we like to operate our freedoms in this country? And then for manufacturing, same exact thing. Don't tell me to buy American and then tell me I can't figure out how to do it.
Yeah, you can't figure out how to do it. All right. Thank each of you for being here.
Well, thank you, Senator Scott. We don't have any other senators who have signed on for either a first or second round of questions, and we are going to have votes in a few minutes. So I am going to call the subcommittee hearing to a close, noting that we didn't get to a couple of topics that I will submit for the record concerning particularly financial accountability in disaster response and IT modernization, both of which are issues that the Commission addressed, and I look forward to the written responses. So I would like to thank all of our witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. Thank you, General Votel, Mr. Fugate, Ms. Rogers, and Mr. Capps for your testimony and for answering our questions. I appreciate the work of all the BENS commissioners and the BENS staff in crafting the report. With unanimous consent, I ask that a copy of the report be included in the hearing record. The Emerging Threats and Spending Oversight Subcommittee will continue to look at emergency preparedness and emerging threats and hold further hearings and take legislative action when and where it is needed. With that, The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on April 8th for the submission of statements and questions for the record. The hearing is now adjourned. Thank you all very much.